You know, there's something that's flown under the radar in the coverage of this awful war that Hamas started against Israel a month ago today. In Britain, there's a huge debate about the BBC, their ABC, about the BBC refusing to call Hamas a terrorist group. Israel has condemned the BBC for just referring to them as militants. But the thing is that our ABC does almost exactly the same. Hamas is listed here officially as a terrorist group in Australia by our security agencies. And of course, we've seen why. I mean, terrorist is business, horrific slaughters, still 250 Jews held hostage now for a month. But the ABC tends to avoid describing Hamas that way. It's reported that Hamas is listed as a terrorist group. It does that. It quotes people saying it's terrorists, but its journalists prefer themselves to refer to Hamas as militants and a militant group. You check the reports, Hamas militants, and again, Hamas militants, or plain militants, or again, Hamas militants. For variety, Hamas gunmen or Hamas-led militants, and then back again to Hamas militants. And this morning on the ABC was exactly the same treatment for another Islamist group listed here again as terrorists.
Is it looking increasingly like Israeli forces may enter a second conflict, this time with the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah?
Joining me is Sophie Elsworth, media writer for the Australian newspaper. Sophie, the ABC's boss told the Senate this year, well, the ABC uses both militant and terrorist to describe Hamas, but my search suggests that's an exaggeration. I found only a couple of journalists who themselves say Hamas terrorists. In the vast majority of reports, it's militants. Should the ABC say plainly, Hamas, they're terrorists?
Well, Andrew, I did some searching myself and came to the same conclusion as you, that they seem to be quite frightened to use the word terrorists. And yes, they should be using it. They are deemed a terrorist organisation. There's no disputing that. But interestingly, I was reading up on the BBC, their reasoning behind it, and their World Affairs editor, John Simpson, said, they go down this route that they don't deem them terrorists because basically that's not an objective view, and it's up to the viewer or the person consuming the news to make up their own minds. So they're not going to use such loaded language. And the BBC has been absolutely hauled over the coals for this, Andrew. These taxpayer-funded organisations seem pretty reluctant to use the word, and it seems quite ridiculous, really.
Well, they don't mind using a loaded language at all when it comes to some other issues. Climate deniers. How about calling Aborigines First Nations, which is a heavily political term imported from Canada, implying that there were nations as a political statement. I mean, this is ridiculous. First Nations is okay, but not calling Hamas what it is, that's not. The BBC, right, what's going on there with this? Because it's becoming a huge embarrassment for it about its policy of, to many, sanitising the Hamas terrorists that have caused this war.
Well, that's right, Andrew. Ever since this whole war started, the BBC has been under the spotlight for not using the word terrorists. And the media over there in the UK has been heavily critical of the BBC. They're always under the spotlight like the ABC are here, but they say it's against their policy and they won't be using that language. So go figure, Andrew. But this is where I think the media lets down the punters out there. Call them out for what they are. And you're damn right, Andrew. Like this language with the First Nations, that is very partisan language. The Indigenous Australians, you rarely hear on the ABC them say Indigenous Australians now. It's always First Nations. This language that's making their way into their, reports, I would argue a lot of it isn't objective, Andrew.
Oh, you're certainly not. So for a matter of time, I just want to ask you quickly, Aboriginal activist Stan Grant gave a speech the other day complaining about Australians voting against The Voice, Labor's Aboriginal-only advisory parliament, calling Australia a place of evil that beheaded people, poisoned their flower. We rubbished it here on the show, or I did, as emotional drivel. Someone else, though, you say was moved.
Yeah, just very quickly, Andrew, the ANU Vice-Chancellor, Brian Smith, wrote a piece on their website saying it was a great speech and everyone should have a listen to it. Now, not forgetting that the university backed in the Voice. So there you go, Andrew. You've got the university supporting Stan Grant.
Well, the university also supported the Voice. Yes, so there you go.